Right. Daisy, welcome to the Create podcast. I am so excited to chat with you about your story, your incredible research, and your brand new book, The Art Cure, which I'm really excited to talk about. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
And I would love for you to share a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this line of work? I'm so fascinated by the link between art and mental health and health in general. And actually, I almost went to school for art therapy as my graduate degree, but decided to pursue my own business and art instead. So I'm very drawn to this field. And I'm curious, how did you come upon this and what got you started?
So I actually come from a family of professional musicians, so very much an arts upbringing. And I assumed I would head down that route myself. When I left school, I worked as a professional pianist, I studied music, but I really missed science. And I think, like lots of people, I had this love for both arts and science. So I got this incredible job working in hospitals, designing and implementing arts programs. And I just found it so life-changing seeing the impact that music and arts were having in hospitals, from stopping children with burns from needing morphine to helping patients with Alzheimer's to remember songs from their past and helping to reduce anxiety attacks before people were having surgery. So I was seeing all of these effects, but I really wanted to understand why they were happening. So I decided to leave the hospital, retrain in science so that I can now work as a scientist, researching the incredible benefits the arts have.
That is so epic and so admirable and amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. What were your first sort of areas of research initially when you first got into this line of work? Because you have covered so much in your book, and I'd love to talk about it in a moment as well, from visual art to music to dance to even watching films and reading books. And so, what was your first sort of area that you tackled?
My first area was looking at how arts engagement affect immune response. So I was looking at these biomarkers, looking at inflammatory proteins in the immune system that are linked to symptoms like depression, as well as to physical illness. I was looking at stress hormones, and I was trying to understand how the psychological experiences that we have through particularly music early on, but now through all of arts engagements, not only make us feel different, but actually physically make our health different as well.
Amazing. And how does it manifest in terms of actual physical health? That's really fascinating because we hear all the time about the mental health benefits, but what are some ways that it actually affects our physiology?
So, what we've seen now from so many studies is that when we engage in relaxing arts activities, it helps to reduce our psychological stress, but also our stress hormones like cortisol. It downregulates our nervous system activity, so particularly our autonomic nervous system, which controls things like our heart rate and blood pressure. And we even see reductions in inflammatory proteins called cytokines, which are really involved in depressive symptoms. But in fact, we're actually learning even deeper things about arts engagement now, that actually arts engagement even affects the patterns of gene expression in our DNA and is actually linked in with a slower pace of biological aging, which sounds like science fiction, but actually we know that there are other behaviors in our lives, like physical activity, that have similar effects. So we sort of know that healthy behaviors can support this slower pace of biological aging, but we're even seeing this now for arts engagement, which is so exciting.
That's great news for us creatives. Amazing. Now, I want to ask you, a lot of our listeners are artists or creatives in some way. It could be a creative business owner as well. And they are probably drawn to the field. They're not really thinking about their health necessarily when they pursue this journey, because as you know, it has so many ups and downs. But what is actually happening for, let's say, a visual artist? A lot of our listeners may be painters or sculptors. And so when they get into the studio, could you give us a quick, maybe a very simple version of what we can expect to see in our brain and our body as we start to work on a painting, let's say?
So, one of the things we see in our brains is that when we start to do things like paints, it actually activates reward centers in the brain that are involved in our pleasure response, the same reward centers that are activated by drugs, sex, and food. So, very much these central reward networks. One of the networks that gets activated is called the dopaminergic mesolimbic reward system, which controls dopamine levels, this neurotransmitter that's involved in feelings of happiness. And what we know is that when people are engaging in arts forms like painting, when they have those moments of joy and euphoria, that's associated with increased levels of dopamine in the brain. And we also see this actually in anticipation of those moments. So when people are making art and they suddenly have that inspiration of what they want to do, that can be a trigger moment. Or if people are looking at art and discovering new things in the painting as they look, that can be another one. But actually, one thing that lots of people talk about as artists is really getting into that flow where you're so absorbed in what you're doing, you're completely losing track of time. And actually, that's another kind of physiological response. Sometimes people feel like tingles or they feel like goosebumps when they're doing their art. And these are known as peak experiences or chills or frisons. And it's just another example of that physiological impact that arts can have on us.
That's so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's like I said, it's such great news for us. Now, I want to ask you something because in your book, you also write about the experience of art, not necessarily just creating the art, playing the music, but to go to a museum, watch a movie, read a book, and all of that. And right now, there's so much going on in the world. An artist may feel guilty about the work that they're creating. They might not feel relevant. Can you give us maybe some ways that art is important, even in times of crisis when you don't feel like what you're doing is important enough and you feel like there's so many, obviously we can still help and volunteer and do all that, but what are some benefits for the viewers and collectors of art?
We have this weird thing in our society where we tend to think of art as this luxury that we only should think about when society is running happily. But I would say to artists, look at every major global disaster, whether it's wars, whether it's pandemics like COVID. When we humans are facing our greatest strife, we always turn to the arts. During COVID, for example, we had people singing from balconies, painting rainbows, reading so many books, streaming so many theatre shows online. Like the arts were one of the absolute fundamentals that got us through collectively through that disaster. And I think this is such a powerful thing for artists to remember. We turn to art at times of our greatest need. It is not a luxury, it's absolutely an essential.
Brilliant. It's such great news. And I totally agree. I think there's so much comfort in even this past week has been crazy snowstorms here and there's this cabin fever, middle of winter vibe, and just going to the museum brought me so much energy and joy and despite of all the other things going on in the world. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I want to ask you about something a little bit on the darker side. As you may know, the creative community has notoriously had mental health issues and maybe depression. And so artists may, on one hand, of course, love their craft and feel really committed to it, but what would you say to an artist who might be having some mental health issues? Should they continue focusing on the art as their outlet, or should they address the mental health concerns first? How does that work when you're experiencing this wonderful area where you get to get that dopamine and express yourself, but then also you might have some personal issues as well?
I think this is a really important issue that I really try to raise up in the book because I don't think we talk enough about what it's like for artists. And actually, what we see in general is that artists typically have higher levels of well-being in their lives and life satisfaction compared to the general population. But they also typically, on average, have higher levels of anxiety and depression. And I think from the research that we've done and the artists I know, it's often not about the art, it's about the conditions that artists have to face, like the really precarious work or the issues around contracts or funding or all of these other challenges that as society we've put around the role of artists. One of the things I keep arguing in the book is this is such a mistake because artists are so fundamental to our communities. Surely we should be enabling them to be able to do their work and supporting it and celebrating it. But I think for artists, one of the helpful things can be to identify if the art itself is causing challenges. So some artists talk about getting very immersed in a piece of art that actually might be focusing on negative emotions and drawing their own emotions down. And actually to recognize when they're getting to the limits of what they feel they're safely managing to when they need to take that step back because art is very emotional. But also to recognize that if art is your job, and the job is causing you stress, maybe you need a different arts hobby that you can be doing on the side to get those creative benefits, but aside from any of the employment related challenges that you might have associated with your main art form.
I love that advice so much. And that's what I tell my friends and clients as well. I think just having a sketchbook where you get to do anything and not show anyone or learn an instrument or take a dance class, I think it's so important. My previous podcast guest actually said that. She's also an artist and she said, my goal for the year was to start a hobby, because so many times we get so enveloped in our work that we just can't enjoy it anymore. So thank you for reaffirming that. Oh, that is so wonderful. Now, speaking of using art, any art, as a hobby or as a creative activity, there are other health benefits such as resilience against dementia that you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about that as a way for us to age more gracefully and sort of prepare ourselves for our later years?
So arts engagement is really special because it activates so many different regions of the brain. So it's really a kind of whole brain workout. And we've seen from so many studies now that when people regularly engage in the arts repeatedly over the years, this actually helps to strengthen neural networks in the brain. It actually helps to increase the connectivity between regions of the brain that can be vulnerable to aging. So helping to actually create a slower pace of brain aging. It actually also relates to something called cognitive reserve, which is the resilience of the brain against cognitive decline. And people who engage more in the arts actually have higher levels of cognitive reserve, which means that they have better preservation of cognition as they get older, and actually a longer time until they develop symptoms of dementia if they're going to. So I think this is a really nice example of people encouraging people to stay creatively active because there are all of these neural benefits as well as things like the mental and physical health benefits.
I love that so much. Is there a certain time that you should spend a day or a week, or it doesn't really matter? Have you found a specific amount that we should practice?
The truth is, it really depends on what you want to achieve. If you are feeling really stressed in the moment, then just a few minutes of arts and crafts can be enough to reduce your stress. But obviously, that's not good. Those few minutes won't have effects that last years. So, if we want to really be building up engagement that might have longer term benefits, and I talk in the book about some of the benefits that can accumulate, a reduced risk of developing depression, for example, then that engagement needs to be regular and also it needs to be sustained. So it's about that regular, sustained engagement. Lots of the studies that have been conducted suggest that having arts activities that you do definitely every single week can have benefits. But of course, if you want to have those day-to-day benefits, it can be really valuable to try and find time to have just even a few minutes every day. And I love in the UK, we've got this thing called the 5 a day for eating your fruit and vegetables. And I really like this because it's just a reminder about have you got your 5 a day? And I encourage people to think, what's their personal equivalent of the 5 a day? Is it 20 minutes or whatever of arts that they might do that day? And they return to that and have that in their mind every day to make sure they've got that regular creativity.
I love that so much. And it's all about building a habit. And it's so funny because in my personal life, sometimes I feel resistant to add these small creative habits because of deadlines. When you become a professional artist, you don't always have the time to play. But I started to see these things as the reason why I'm even a professional artist. That's where all my ideas come from. That's where I feel more relaxed and clear-minded. So it's always the things that we struggle to make the space for, I think, that are most beneficial for us. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I want to talk about your brand new book, Art Cure, which is incredible. And there's so much research in here and so many beautiful stories too. I love the way you embedded real life examples from people that you either worked with, met, or just examples in general. I would love to hear what inspired you to write it right now. How many years of research was this? I'm so curious about the process of this brilliant book.
So I actually got inspired to write this because I wrote a report for the World Health Organization about the evidence on arts and health. And initially we thought it would be this small report, but then when it was released, it was downloaded 250,000 times. It's
Wow.
become the most downloaded evidence report from WHO Europe. And that really made me realize that this is not a niche thing. It's something that's got huge interest and appeal. So, but when I tell people about what I do, people seem really unaware about how advanced the science now is. It's been this bizarrely well-kept secret. So I thought, well, we're seeing all these books about physical activity, diet, sleep, these other health behaviors. Surely art should have its own book to celebrate what it does to us. So that's what I would try to achieve with Art Cure, is presenting the science, but as you say, bringing it to life with the real stories of artists and real people, and also having very practical takeaways at the end of each chapter, which I call the daily dose, that tell people how they can put the science into action in their own lives to improve their health.
That's amazing. And who would you like to read this book? Obviously, everyone, but I think there's people who might be great messengers of this important work. Do you have a specific reader in mind?
I want it to be for everybody. I've written it so it explains the science, but you don't have to have any science background to understand it. But really, I've also written this as a kind of love letter to the arts world because I feel like artists are constantly having to justify their work and justify their value and try and get funding. And it feels like it can often be this uphill struggle, and it really shouldn't be given how valuable the arts and artists are to society. So I'm really hoping that this book is also a kind of manifesto for why we should all be valuing the arts more and something that artists can use to hold up and say, like, this is why we are so special in society.
It's so needed. Thank you for giving us literal evidence of that the work we do is important. And I was surprised last week. I met a 13-year-old girl who told me they had no art classes in her middle school, and I was literally shocked, upset, because those are my favorite classes when I was growing up, and now knowing how important they were. And is there anything you would say to the arts community? You have a lot of people who are into activism and showing up and spreading this kind of message. How can we advocate for more arts, whether it's in schools or hospitals or even community centers? What can we do both individually and as a community to raise this awareness?
I really try and flag this in the closing chapters of the book. So I try and shine a light on all the arts funding cuts that actually are happening. Because I think a lot of this is actually sharing that message. And you mentioned about that child, the teenager that you, actually, as I say in the book, there are currently 2 million children in the US who have no access to the arts in their school at all. So I think we have to get these statistics and be able to shout about them more so that people are aware. But I also say in the book that I feel there's this exciting moment coming for the arts. I call it a seatbelt moment because the best analogy I have is in the 1990s when suddenly seatbelts became mandatory in cars, even though scientists had been talking about it for years and people had been lobbying about how important this was to health. But I feel that's kind of where we're getting to with talking about arts and health is actually this, there is a change in public awareness happening. There is a shift in bodies like the World Health Organization now really recognizing the arts. And I feel like collectively, if we can spread the word, if we can highlight the benefits that we see from the arts, if artists can shout about the challenges they're facing so it all becomes more visible, and also individuals can start to champion the arts in their local communities, like buying works from local artists, engaging in local arts workshops, then maybe we can actually achieve that seatbelt moment and that big sea change in public opinion and awareness and valuing of the arts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that. When is this book coming out and what else do you have going on? How can we follow your work and support you?
It is coming out on the 3rd of February in the US. It's already been out in the UK, and it has been so exciting to see all the sort of buzz and excitement about appreciating the arts. If you're interested in looking at events, I'm coming over to the US to speak a number of times this year, and that's all available on my research group's website, which is sbbresearch.org/artcure. And I can give that to you to put in the link underneath this program.
Amazing. I will definitely include the links to the book and to your website and events. Daisy, thank you so much for sharing this amazing resource, for writing it, and all the important work you're doing. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all artists. Thank you so much for putting all these facts together and helping us understand how important this work really is.
It's been such a joy. Thank you.